lockdown, and we're very pleased to have so many amazing guests, and really honored to have two amazing women actually for this next session. I'm so proud and happy to have Amna Nawaz here from PBS NewsHour. We've been following her for so many years through her journalistic journey from ABC News Digital. She actually was helped us at one of our events in New York in 2015, 2016. She's a long time sort of acquaintance of ours, but we're really pleased to have her. We're going to be discussing sort of covering the coronavirus and everything that everyone's going through, and she's got a very unique vantage point to do that. But also so does Ginella Massa, who's an anchor at CityNews in Toronto, and she's a longtime Concordian. And we thought that we'd have this great conversation between the two of them. And so I will turn it over to you, Ginella, to lead the conversation. And thank you again, Amna, for joining us.
Thanks so much for having us. Good morning. Assalamu alaikum. Ramadan Kareem to everybody. I know sometimes on the weekend, we maybe stay up a little too late between iftar and sahur. So I'm definitely feeling it a little bit this morning. How are you, Amna?
I'm doing very well, mashallah, alhamdulillah. How are you?
Good, alhamdulillah. Just a little bleary-eyed this morning, but I plan to take a nap after this. So, it's been a very interesting time for everybody, not just those of us who work in news, but I guess we have kind of a unique vantage point. I see your setup there actually, so maybe I'll start there and tell me a little bit about how work logistically has changed for you, and kind of how you're going about doing your stories, doing your reports, and I'm assuming that you're working from home now.
I do, and in fact, this is why I brought my laptop down here to do the conversation, because I wanted to show this is what it takes now for me to do my job. This is my setup. This is we are in my basement, in my home. My children and my husband and my dog are upstairs. You may hear them at some point. I'll apologize in advance.
And how old are your children?
They are 6 and 4, mashallah.
Oh wow, okay. Yes. That's a challenge.
Yes, challenging. And they are 6 and 4, so they're loud. They want to be loud sometimes. Their schools are closed. They're home. My husband is running their home school. I work most of the day and come down here to do show every night from 6 to 7. But this is what it takes. I'm in my basement. There's a whole camera setup. You can't see off of this camera right now too. And we are slowly starting to go back out. One of the things, the NewsHour is a little different in that we're not doing spot news every day. We do a lot of newsmaker interviews. We go out in the field for like a week at a time, which we just can't do right now. So we're slowly starting to figure out how we can safely go back out and about. But for the most part, we are under lockdown, which complicates our jobs, as you well know too. It's really hard to report when you cannot go out and talk to people and knock on doors and spend time with them.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll share, I'm kind of in a unique position in my situation where I'm basically the only on-air person who's still going into the newsroom. All of our reporters are essentially working remotely as you are working from home. And we're going to hear a little bit from, we're going to have a couple folks joining the conversation in about 20 minutes or so, including one of my colleagues who's also working from home. And we can talk to them a little bit about that too. So I'm going into almost an empty newsroom. I think there's like maybe 5 people in the newsroom really, and then we're kind of in our corners, so I don't really interact with anybody. And I'm sure a newsroom is usually very bustling and busy, and you're able to collaborate and interact and ask questions and get ideas. And right. So I'm feeling very, very isolated, doing our newscasts at night on my own. So I want to ask, yeah, you kind of touched on it. How does that change the ways that you tell stories and the ways that you talked about, reaching out to people, being able to go to a place, knock on doors, get characters? So how has that changed for you in terms of being able to access stories, in terms of research and doing interviews?
So 2 things I'll say on that. One is logistically, it's very challenging. We are used to making calls, finding people who agree to let us into their homes and into their lives, showing up, spending time, really understanding what it is that they have to say and what their story is, and then conveying that story to the rest of the public. We can't do that now. So the phone part still exists. We're still reaching out like crazy or having people reach out to us, But what's been really interesting to see is how, I think because everyone is so isolated right now, how much more willing people are to work with you to share their story. So we've actually been able to put together incredible tape pieces. I mean, my producers leave me in awe every day because we've been putting together tape packages, meaning you have a taped interview, you have some picture to go with that, you've got a bunch of elements that you can kind of edit together to make it work. And they're doing that all basically with one arm tied behind their back. You know, they're reaching out to people and saying, we want to interview, we want your story. We can do it over Skype, we can do it over Zoom, we can do it over FaceTime. Can you or your family or your friends shoot some video of you doing these kinds of things? Can we use that video?
Oh, you get them to shoot their own B-roll for you.
Exactly, yes. And we use a lot more pictures than we used to, right? We just have to get very creative about the way we do our jobs. And that's not bad. You know, I think everyone else out there watching the news will see the production quality doesn't quite look the way it used to, right? Everyone's getting very used to being broadcasters, used to over Zoom. Like everyone knows what that feels like and looks like now. So we've kind of compromised maybe on a few of the things where we used to hold ourselves to a certain standard because we know it's more important to make sure we're still making the contacts and we're still getting those stories out there. And that's kind of where we are right now.
Okay, so speaking of content and information and facts, obviously that's such an important part every day of our jobs. But how much more important do you find it now to make sure that you're able to kind of separate fact from fiction, make sure that your viewers are actually being able to take away something from the reports that you're doing every night, because there is so much information. Things are changing every day. I know for me, you know, being in it, even for me, it was hard to keep track of what's been canceled, what's the new announcement, what funding has come down, you know, here in Canada. And so I can only imagine how hard it is for the viewers to keep up and to be able to you know, parcel out or get these bite-sized pieces of what applies to them. How important is that for you, and how do you kind of make decisions about what you're going to focus on in terms of the stories that you're doing?
I mean, you're absolutely right. It's so confusing. Confusion sort of reigns supreme day to day from time to time here, and it's probably goes without saying a very different picture here in the United States than it is in Canada. Largely because of the way this White House and this federal administration didn't respond to early signs and actually get and testing and respond to that there. We can talk about that a little later. But it challenges us for a number of reasons. One is we're not just talking about here's what you should know about someone's policy on climate change. Here's what you should know about.
I know you could just me, but I was losing you for a minute. Are folks able to hear Amna? It was kind of cutting out a little bit. Okay, that's a little bit better. Do you want to start over that answer?
Yeah, sorry about that. My connection may come and go. Hopefully it stays. If you can hear me, what I was saying was, great. The challenge for us has been, we're not just talking about policy positions or congressional bills or, you know, certain stories that affect one part of the country and not the other. We're talking about life and death. And when we're having those conversations, what you want to get to people is the kind of information that helps them to make decisions to keep themselves and their family safe. So it's like, you couldn't have more on the line when you're talking about getting facts and science and information into people's hands. And that's why instead of just covering, this is what so-and-so said, this is what so-and-so said, there's news, as you should know, we try to dig a little deeper on this and say, this is what everyone said. We went to these experts, and we're going to spend 5 minutes walking through what this person says is true and not true. This is what you need to know, whether you should go to the grocery store, whether you should keep your kids out of school, whether you should be taking a shower every time you come back for a walk. It's these kinds of little things that we're really digging into in a way that we didn't before, and it's changed now.
And so do you think journalists feel the weight of that? You talked about the idea that this isn't just about, this is what one politician said, it's life or death information. And, you know, and we're coming days off of, you know, a presser where the president talked about disinfectant and how it could potentially, you know, be used to cure or treat coronavirus. And that has real consequences. Do you feel like journalists now feel a weight in a way they didn't before, where they really have to diligently and in real time fact check and challenge the president in a way that they were, you know, being a little softer before?
I think This president's always presented a challenge when it comes to fact checking, because there is so much misinformation and bad information offered at any given time that we really had to become, and it's been a challenge for all journalists, we've had to become sort of not picky about what we choose to fact check, but really like, this is the most important thing we need to focus on, and let's move on.
You have to pick your battles a little bit sometimes.
You do. And that's always been a challenge with this administration. Now, as I said, when we're dealing with life and death, it ramps it up a little bit. And so you've seen in the press corps in the White House, people get a little bit more aggressive when it comes to challenging things that the president said will really down places where he diverts.
Sorry, I'm
you. Oh gosh, I'm so sorry. Can you hear me okay?
Okay, now it's fine. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
So you find the press corps is a little bit pushing back a little bit more and being a little more aggressive.
They're a little bit more aggressive, and especially in the places where it's clear he diverts even from his own scientific experts that are on his White House task force. The disinfectant line was a moment that I really never thought would happen in my career, where I had to interview an expert and say, what can you tell us about what science tells us about injecting or ingesting disinfectant, and what did you think when the president said it? And obviously every expert we've talked to has said it's ridiculous. Please don't do it. It's dangerous. And it's dangerous. Yeah, we ourselves had to put out reports that said, please don't do this. It's very dangerous. And I don't think any journalist ever thought that they would be doing that. But the other part of it is, we are living through it at the same time we're reporting on it. And every journalist I know has, either kids or parents that they're worried about, or colleagues they're worried about, and loved ones in different cities in the country that they're worried about. I myself have already lost 2 colleagues to COVID. We had a dear friend who was hospitalized and on a ventilator and is now, thank goodness, doing much better. But we worry in the same ways. My parents live nearby. I do their grocery shopping for them at the same time I'm doing reporting. We're all living through it at the same time. And that's another reason that it's very, very different for journalists.
It's very much impacting us in a way that other stories maybe aren't necessarily. And so I'm going to ask one last question before I kind of open it up to a group here. You're in Washington?
I'm just outside of Washington in Virginia. Yeah. So
you don't attend the White House briefings then?
No, I do not for this administration. We have a White House correspondent who attends those.
Okay, I have to ask, and maybe you can share if you've spoken with your colleague. It is super frustrating for me to watch any of those press conferences. I actually kind of actively try to avoid watching them. My husband loves watching them, and I just get so frustrated that it's like, he just makes my skin crawl. Like the way that he answers questions, the way that he attacks journalists, he's very condescending. His understanding of his role as the president and his power. And I can only imagine, for me, I get to shut it off and say, I don't even want to take part in this. I'm happy I'm in Canada and I'm glad I'm not a journalist there. But I can only imagine what it's like when it's your job to do that, and how difficult it can be to find that balancing act between pushing back and asking questions at the risk of being berated, being scolded, or being, locked out essentially from being able to ask questions. How difficult is it as a journalist to balance those things in terms of pushing back and still being able to even just get access to the president and ask those questions that need to be asked?
So I'll say this is the 3rd administration I've covered in the US. And I spent a few years overseas, so I wasn't as in-depth covering early Obama and late Bush here. One of my journalistic guideposts, right, one of my North Stars has always been keep it simple. Especially when it feels very, very complicated, keep it as simple as you can and remember why you're doing what you're doing. And one of the approaches we have this administration is that you have to be as rigorous, and you have to be as aggressive, and you have to be as willing to push back and fix whatever comes at you as you would with any other administration. And that's on us as journalists, because that speaks to our credibility. We were journalists long before this White House, and we'll be journalists long after this White House. And so to that degree, nothing changes, right? You hear something that's not right, you follow up. You hear something that's, maybe confusing or contradicts something from earlier, you follow up. we don't control, and this is a lesson I tell my girls all the time, right? Like, you can't control what anyone else does. You can only control what you do. And that's just a lesson for life. But it's a really important lesson for us as journalists right now, too. We have no control over the way that the president or anyone in his administration responds. And we've seen them respond like the other president administrations have. It doesn't change what we do. And I think we have to work a little harder. I think the follow-ups have been a little bit more pointed, a little bit more aggressive. But that's just because
I've
that's what
definitely
it
noticed a shift.
Yeah, it's what it takes to get to the facts, and it's what it takes to get to the truth. And so we want to meet the moment. I think that's what moment has brought us right now.
Yeah. And to that point also, at what point, and I've noticed this shift as well, that some news outlets, and you're not in daily news, but some news outlets have taken to say, we're not going to take the president's presser live. We're going to roll on it, and we're going to cut clips, and we're going to play it later on. Because it's maybe, is it because it's too difficult to fact check immediately and they feel the responsibility to do so, or that it would be irresponsible to just let it air in its entirety without any sort of reaction? What's kind of the thinking behind that, and saying just because the president is speaking doesn't mean we're going to take it live on our network?
Yeah, so we actually are in daily news. We have a show every day in the hour, but we're not cable news. We're not 24/7. And you've seen the cable news networks here really be the ones who basically every time the president steps in front of the podium, put it live because it's the president, and that's what we would do. There's been a ton of conversation in the U.S. right now around why that journalistic point has been there. Did we do the same thing with Obama? Did Obama speak less publicly than this president does? Sure, do the same thing with Bush. That feels like eons ago now. And I think you've seen different networks respond different ways. Like, I've actually seen some places that have a really robust digital platform stream the entire conference live, but then have live fact checking going on in a sort of a second panel next to it. And I think to the degree that that's possible, people should absolutely do that, because we don't want to censor anything. It is the president of the United States, but at the same time, we have a responsibility to make sure we're not just amplifying bad information.
Right.
So
we have a responsibility to say, this is the ludicrous thing that he said, which is also very dangerous and untrue.
Exactly. And I'm sure you've noticed there's another thing people have been doing, which is like a lot of people kind of live tweet the press conference, like, oh, he said this, now this person said that, now he said this. And what I've noticed, a really dramatic shift in people who are just doing that straight, like, and now people are saying, oh, he said this, but the important to know about this is 2 weeks ago, he said something different. Or he just said this, but you remember the experts on his panel are saying the exact opposite. So we've
providing
had
that context immediately.
Yeah, but it's, like we said, it's a dangerous time.
Yeah, and I notice also one of the other tactics is using the keys, the chyrons, the graphics at the bottom of the screen to say Trump has falsely said X, Y, and Z, or Trump said X, Y, and Z weeks after he said this other thing, right? So using the keys
the false claim that.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks so much, Amna. I want to open up the panel and invite some of my other friends and colleagues to join us in this conversation, and to just broaden it outside of the US, because we know a lot of Concordians are watching from all over. So I'm going to invite Shaheen Sattar. She is a producer with Channel 4 News, I believe. Do I have that correct? Hang on, I'm just going to pull up my notes here. Yes, a freelance journalist, and you're an interview producer with Channel 4 News in London. We got a chance to meet last year at Concordia. Good to see you again. Hi, Shaheen.
Hello.
And my good friend and colleague, Malia Sheikh, who is here in Canada, just outside of Toronto. And I haven't seen her in like 2 months. So I'm very happy to see her
Very sad.
This Sunday morning. I know. Hi, Assalamualaikum. How are you? Good. Maybe I'll start by asking both of you what I started by asking Amna, is how logistically your workspace, your work flow has changed. Shaheen, I don't know if are you still going into the newsroom? Are you working from home? How has your day-to-day changed with the pandemic?
Thanks, Ginella. I hope everyone can hear me. So my workflow has changed in that a lot of people are sort of staying at home now, and I'm sort of going into the newsroom. But a lot of us journalists can, we can all vouch for the same thing, that we've never been more busy. I don't think I've ever seen, a news flow as busy as, it's not just differing stories now. It's one story with several angles. So I'm going into the newsroom. The editors have sort of asked us to come in later to make sure we're not using public transport at peak times. Early on, it started quite, where we started sort of using Skypes. I remember Skyping David and Sally Abel from the Diamond Princess cruise ship, which was a huge story. Everyone was baffled by, this entire cruise ship that had, an X amount of coronavirus cases, and now, well, where are we now? But
lost them a lot.
A world away from world. But yeah, very, very busy now. So it was really sort of like a trial run when we sort of started, and I don't think we've ever had to do anything like this before as a newsroom. Logistically, it's very difficult. The viewers have had to get used to having, literally just Skypes and FaceTimes now, which, as Amna said, makes people a lot more willing to come on the show when they don't have to when we don't have to force them to go to a studio. So yeah, it's a lot nicer to sort of have them, have more people, more, a diverse amount of people, be on the show, because they can just do it on Skype and FaceTime.
There's also no excuse to say no. What else are you doing? Oh, I'm busy. No one can say, oh, I'm busy, or I have something else to do.
Exactly, yeah. But also what Amna said as well is, early on we had to sort of, because everything was a trial run, we'd never had, false news to this scale. I think in India they had to like shut down WhatsApp messages or something between certain people. You had to, I think WhatsApp had or Facebook had something, where you couldn't share things or forward things or something at, a certain amount of times. We had lots of videos of cadets in South London, lots of rumors going around, what you should do when you have coronavirus and stuff. And so choosing between which things to fact check and choosing between what not to fact check, early on we had to sort of decipher that very quickly.
Yeah. Malia, tell us a little bit about the challenges of working from home, because you also have a young child who, if you follow Malia on Instagram, she posted a video the other day of him running into the room butt naked. At the end of she was trying to shoot a stand-up. So what's it been like working from home? You haven't been in the newsroom in months, and trying to put your stories together.
It's been really hard, basically because I think when you're a parent, it just adds a whole new layer to what you're doing, because a lot of what we do, you need to use 100% of your brain power and really be able to focus on that. So I actually wear two hats. I report during the week and I do weather on the weekend. So this kind of started when I went to New York a few weeks ago, when all of this started happening. So there was a state of emergency when I was in New York, and then I ended up reporting for CityNews while I was there, which was a very interesting, adrenaline-filled experience. Being there, my husband was my camera person, using my iPhone, and it was kind of cool, I think, for me to have my husband see what I do so up close and personal. And I think he was like, I didn't realize it was so intense. I didn't realize that you're always working on these kinds of deadlines, because I'm in the newsroom. I'm never really with him. He's never gotten to see what I do. He's somebody who works from home quite a bit. So anyway, I come back and I was in self-isolation for 14 days because that was CityNews policy. And, I thought, okay, I guess I'll be maybe helping out with web or whatever, but they actually had me reporting every single day from home. And I think that was the first time where we were all trying to figure out what the new normal was going to be. Like, how, at first I was like, how is it possible for me to be able to be putting together a report when I don't have a camera person, I don't have anything, I'm here on my own. But it was really interesting and kind of cool to see how much you're capable of doing. So it's been challenging in the sense where I'm always stressed out about my son walking into a shot. And I've posted a number of these videos on my Instagram. I think it's pretty funny because I've had a lot of people reach out to me saying, wow, like, you guys are just like us, right? It's like we're working from home. Everybody's kids are annoying. Great, we love them. But meaning they will make your life a little disruptive. You know what I mean? So I think it's kind of nice. And I've had one friend say to me, it's so nice to see that, journalists, reporters, you guys are just people trying to get your job done. It's just you're in front of the camera. So it's definitely been hard. It's weird also being at home. I think we're so used to hitting the ground, running, meeting people in person, and all of a sudden that's kind of gone. but I think it's a very interesting time to be a journalist and or a reporter right now, because I think people are realizing just how important the media is, and because we deliver the news and we're letting people know what happens. So I think it's that is my son. Okay, he wants money to go to Walmart. Anyway, so yeah, that is my experience right now.
You know, you kind of touched on something, the idea that people are realizing the importance of news. I don't know about you, Amna, but we got emails from our bosses saying, you know, ratings are up. Lots more people are watching. You know, is that the experience for PBS? Do you have, you know, new viewers, more viewers, and do you feel more of a responsibility in that sense that people are tuning in because, you know, they need the news now more than ever?
There was actually just a big profile piece across all the broadcast networks in the US in Variety, looking at just how much the audience has grown in the last 3 months. I think they're up something like 35 to 40%, which in terms of audience growth in that time is ridiculous. But it's also, for me, it's really comforting, honestly, because that is why I wanted to do this in the first place. Right? When bad things happen, you want people to have a place to go where they feel like they can get something that they trust. And honestly, the last time I felt this way was covering the 9/11 attacks here in Washington, because that was literally like 3 weeks into my very first job ever. It was like the lowest from the totem pole. But that's the same feeling. I remember that it was the entire world has gone into chaos. No one knows which way is up. We have no idea what happens next. Where do people go? And it was, they come to us. We're supposed to have the information. We're supposed to have the somber resolve. We're supposed to have that thing that gets them through this hour, the next one, and this one, and the next one. And we're in that same time period now. So yes, absolutely. The responsibility is enormous. I think to what Sheena and we have talked about, it's different because we're all living through it too. Like figuring out when you can take public transport, figuring out where you can be busy, so it doesn't run into your life shot. It's different that way, but yes, the stakes have never been higher.
Yeah, and so Sheena, I want to turn my attention to you because I want to learn a little bit about what things are like in the UK in terms of what is the mood or sort of the understanding of this virus. You know, I look at Canada and, you know, we've shut everything down. We also have a public healthcare system. We have, you know, stimulus money coming from the government. Then I look at the US and, you know, we see the president talking about, you know, for many, many weeks, sort of kind of downplaying it, talking about, you know, this sort of misinformation. And then you have a private healthcare system. So in the UK, I feel like you've got kind of a little bit of both worlds, where you've got this prime minister who at the beginning had a, you know, different attitude towards it. Then he himself came down with coronavirus and was sick for many weeks. But you also have a public healthcare system. Can you kind of talk to me about how this is sort of playing out in the UK and what sort of the feeling is from people? Are they taking it seriously? Is there a feeling that this is all kind of overblown? Is there a feeling that the healthcare system is handling it? Can you just kind of paint a picture for us about what things are like in the UK?
So a lot of the general mood in the UK is that we have nothing under control, and that the different facts and figures that we're being presented with are, you know, exceptionally false. Perhaps, you know, I'm saying that because I'm at Channel 4 News and, you know, someone would say that's obviously what you would say. But a lot of the advice that we were getting in the beginning was around herd immunity. There is no transparency as of yet. The scientific advisory group that advises the government right now, the minutes from those meetings are not to be published until the crisis is over. For a journalist and for a free press, that's, you know, it's unbelievable that could happen. You know, the transparency around how this herd immunity came about, you know, what was being said at meetings, you know, we're not able to interview ministers as we were able to before. Sure, we have a daily press conference, but, you know, as any, you know, news service right now, I'm sure PBS, you know, I know you, Ginella, in Canada, you know, our ratings and, you know, the amount of viewers that we have, because everyone's at home right now, you feel this really big, you know, overwhelming sense of duty to deliver great news stories to the public. But if you can't hold ministers to account, and if you can't fact check, then, you know, how are we able to do that? So a lot of the sentiment around coronavirus is, you know, it's a really awful thing. There are around 16,000 deaths right now. An FT analysis showed that there are actually 40,000 deaths. We're not counting the deaths in care homes. We're not counting, you know, the deaths that are happening in people's houses. I would say on a news level, you know, a lot of the news that is available is so different between different organizations that, you know, for the public, it's very difficult for them to, I don't know, trust either which source or whatever. On a sort of general level, everyone's taking it very seriously. Obviously, on a behavioral psychology level, you can't keep, you know, humans in general under lockdown for too long, and we're all getting fatigued. So we're seeing a lot more people outside now, I think, because it's a lot more sunny, and 20 degrees Celsius is sunny for people in London, I'll have you know. But no, humans, they can't stay indoors for too long. China literally had to weld people into their homes, and you can't do that over here. So, you know, there's huge queues at grocery stores, but people are really coming for it. We have a clap for NHS workers at 8 p.m. And on the NHS, actually, you know, that there was a huge worry at the beginning that, you know, the NHS was, you know, it would be overburdened by this. A lot of the discussion right now is on bioethics and which sort of patients that they can refuse to have in the hospital. I think it's 1 in 4,000, or actually fact check me on that, actually. I mean, don't quote me on that. 1 in 4,000 people in the UK have access to an ICU a bed. But a lot of the discussion right now is on PPE. Yes. That's available to well, NHS workers, care workers, people who work in care homes and stuff. I know that my mum is a care worker herself, but hasn't been given adequate PPE. It's a real, you know, for Boris Johnson and for, you know, the Chancellor to come outside of their homes at number 10 and number 11 Downing Street and clap for care workers, whilst at the same time not delivering them PPE, is a real, you know, it's a real struggle to, you know, want to have ministers on the show, but to really grill them and question them on the real facts and why they're not delivering the very things that we need our heroes to, you know, remove this, you know, virus from our.
Yeah, that's definitely been a concern here in Canada, is access to protective gear as well in the hospitals, and particularly in the long-term care homes, like nursing homes for seniors. That's where the big majority of the cases have been. And one of the big questions here has been around workers working in multiple homes, because personal support workers, it's a low-wage job. And a lot of these places will only hire people part-time, so that they don't have to give them benefits. And so they end up working multiple jobs in multiple centers. And that is how the virus has been spreading amongst a vulnerable population. So that's one of the big criticisms here in Canada. Malia, I want to ask you a little bit to share about some of the types of stories that we're doing. So obviously in news, you know, we have kind of the sort of the big headline news of the day, because we have these almost daily 3 press conferences, the federal level, the provincial level, and the municipal level. And we kind of get those out of the way, but then we do other types of stories as well. Malia, can you share a little bit of some of the types of stories that you're covering in terms of the people who have been impacted by this pandemic?
Yeah, I've gotten a chance to cover a lot of different types of stories these past couple of weeks. Just like you said, how is COVID-19 pandemic affecting people? One of the big stories, or a couple of them that stick out in my head, was there was this lawyer, Michael Pierce, very well known in the community, who basically had a foot infection and went to the hospital, wasn't really given much attention. They kind of just gave him medication. He went home. It kept getting progressively worse. And because of what's happening with COVID-19, you're not allowed to go into the hospital with somebody. So his mom, who was getting very stressed out about her son, because he's very smart, he's a lawyer, but he's also the type of person who would always downplay things, like doesn't want to be a bother to anybody. So her thing was, okay, well, Michael, when you go to the hospital, make sure you explain to them that this is what's wrong. You're in excruciating pain and you need to be admitted there. So she dropped him off to the hospital. They kind of send him home with a new prescription. Hours later, he dies at home. And this whole story was, are people who don't have COVID-19 being given the medical attention that they need, or are they being looked over? And the big concern here was, like, everyone keeps talking about, you know, this fear of hospitals being taken over by COVID-19 patients, but a lot of emergency, you know, staff are saying how it's empty. There's not a lot of cases here. So how did something like this happen? Was this just like, was he just overlooked because of that? So that was a story that really sticks out. Another one is funerals is a big thing right now, where if it's a difficult time to say goodbye to loved ones. So I did a story on a 4-year-old boy named Hamza who is dying from cancer, has been given weeks, if not days to live, and how, because everything's closed right now, his parents are feeling very sad and frustrated because they're like, he had such simple wishes. Like, he wanted to go to the zoo. He wanted to go to Legoland. He wanted to go horseback riding, but because of COVID-19, everything's closed and they can't even give him a proper final goodbye, and they can't even give him the burial that they would want to do. So after that story aired, that story really affected me, because again, as a parent, you're looking at any type of story to do with children. I just find it very difficult to tell. But, after that story aired, the Toronto Zoo opened up for him, gave him a private visit. That was really cool. Mississauga Fire came to his home and put on their fire trucks because little boys love fire engines. And so that was a difficult story, but also I think it was something that a lot of parents or people can relate to who are losing loved ones right now. So we are doing a lot of stories to do with COVID-19, but also how it's impacting other parts of people's lives. Another story I did recently was on truck drivers and how they are being denied using washrooms. When they're out on the roads, they're considered essential workers, but a lot of the time they're being, told that they can't use a Tim Hortons washroom and they have nowhere to go. So we know that the city and the province are telling people to open up businesses and let them do it, but that's not really happening right now. So we're doing a lot of stories, different angles. I think we're really trying to find that human angle, as we always do. And just so I guess people know that they're not alone, and that, we're trying to cover all parts of this whole pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, I think this pandemic literally has impacted every single person in the world, but it's impacting people in lots of different ways that, maybe we haven't even thought of, right? And so us trying to find some of those stories and shed light on some of those stories, especially when it's like, people are at home feeling like, oh, it sucks, I can't go outside. It's like, well, this is a problem, or maybe you feel sad or upset, but here are what some other people are going through. Here's a business that is a 50-year business that is now not going to be able to survive after the pandemic because they got evicted because they couldn't pay the rent, or this person who is about to lose their son and they couldn't complete his final bucket list because everything was shut down, right? So for offering some perspective and some stories about some of the different things that people are facing. I want to ask a little bit broadly, not just specific to coronavirus, but, as women of color in the newsroom, kind of what sort of the reaction is, or, how you feel you were able to bring in certain stories or diverse voices. Is there a willingness to cover certain stories? Do you find it difficult sometimes? Do you have to push back to give certain stories or certain voices attention, whether it is on coronavirus or on other stories? We've been doing stories on, the push for the collection of race-based data around coronavirus. Maybe if I could kind of go around the room, Amna, I'll start with you. How do you find it, being a woman of color in the newsroom and, being able to cover certain types of stories? And actually, I think you did a story as well on the impact of race on coronavirus.
I did. Yeah, it's something we continue to cover because it's of the utmost importance, not just now when we're talking about the health crisis, but the inevitable economic crisis that's going to follow, right? And people of certain communities, that is to say, people in communities of color, women of color in particular, are being hit hardest right now and will continue to be hit hardest. So You know, on the question of like how difficult it is to raise, I think early in my career, it's true that I've often been like the only person of color in the room, certainly the only woman of color sometimes in the room. And early in my career, it's really hard when you're just trying to find your feet and trying to figure out where you fit into the system to be the one speaking up to say, well, why are we phrasing it that way? And why don't we look at it from this angle? And I think it took some time, and I wonder if other people have the same experience. But now in my career, and really for the last several years, I realize if I am the only one in the room, it doesn't get heard unless I say it. And so I've been sort of like, well, who knows what they'll think about it, but it has to be said. So you have to kind of be willing to raise your hand and say those things, especially because that is the business we are in. We're in the business of raising questions and talking about uncomfortable things. And sometimes it makes people in the room and the people that you work with uncomfortable. And that takes a certain level of inner strength that I'd like to think I'm still working on, but we have to do, especially right now. I think generally speaking, I've been lucky to always work in newsrooms where at least those ideas were heard. You know, maybe they were dismissed behind closed doors when I wasn't around, but I was at least entertained. And now, you know, now that I'm a substitute anchor and I'm senior national correspondent, I feel like I've got credibility and years behind me. I'm at a place now where my ideas have the platform to move forward. And I take none of that for granted because I know exactly how hard it was for me early on to say those things. And I never, ever want other younger women of color coming up under me to feel like they can't speak up. So yeah, I think it's important for all of us as we move through our careers to continue to make sure that not just we're able to do the work that we know is important and that we're speaking from positions of authority within our own community and experience, but that we keep kind of holding the door open to make sure that other women can continue to walk through and feel emboldened to speak up too.
Shaheen, can I ask a little bit about what your experience has been like in the journalism world as a young woman, Muslim woman, Asian woman? What has it been like in the newsroom? And is the newsroom diverse? Do you often find yourself being the only one?
So I'm actually quite lucky to work in a very diverse newsroom. A lot of the stories that are BME, well, not a lot of the stories, but stories that are BME related, or by BME I mean Black, minority, ethnic, or POC, or sort of people of colour. A lot of these stories I sort of get given anyway, just on an interview producer level. So for example, there was a story on Muslim burials and the story of Ismail Wahab, who had to be buried, you know, with only 5 people attending his funeral. You know, I think there were 5 people in the graveyard. You know, a mass burial of people, of Muslims, because there's a backlog of Muslims now who can't be buried. And there's 24-hour period that they have to be buried in. A mass grave that's been built in Southeast London to bury 10 people at once now. I knew something like that was built in New York, but they had no idea that, you know, there's one in London too. As an interview producer at Channel 4 News, I think I've had to really sort of lead on having more BME doctors on the screen, because a lot of the doctors that we do have on screen, for some reason, all tend to be really old and really white. And, you know, I don't know if you guys know that, I mean, you guys can obviously mirror the sentiment in that, like, all the doctors I know are brown. So how is it that all of a sudden we now have all of the really old white doctors, you know, speaking for everyone now? But what was a really, you know, terrible story that we did have in the UK was, you know, I think it's 68% now of the NHS staff, and that includes, you know, doctors, nurses who have died, are BME. So having to cover this, you know, really terrible, really sort of, you know, sensitive story, contacting, you know, relatives and stuff, you know, it comes at an advantage that I can, you know, connect with them on a level that other producers may not be able to. You know, so there are sort of different facets really to being the newsroom then. You know, you can connect with different people in different ways, you know, different angles to have on the show. You can bring different people on the show. So I make it a point now to always bring female doctors, female scientists, Black doctors particularly. You know, we know there's, you know, the Asian sort of, you know, stereotype of having doctors and stuff. But another story that's really sort of, you know, affected the UK particularly is the amount of BME deaths that we have. So 1/3 of the people who have died in the UK are BME. You know, there was a real pushback in covering it initially, and there was a real pushback from government really to you know, sort out an inquiry to, you know, figure out why this was happening. You know, having to push it in your newsrooms as well. You know, I can mirror, you know, with Amna, you know, I can sort of mirror what you said there, in that, like, if you're not the one saying it, then no one else will. You have to say it, and you have to push that story. And I think it was, you know, the real efforts of a lot of BME people in, you know, different national newsrooms that we were able to get an inquiry done, you know, by Downing Street. And then another side of it actually as well is that, you know, if you have, you know, what duty do you have to, you know, make sure you report on a story, while at the same time making sure that you don't, you know, sort of, you know, grow that anti-immigration, anti sort of, you know, that racist sort of sentiment that you can. If you have a mosque that is open, and if you have a lot of Asians in, you know, on, you know, Tooting High Street, which is a very sort of, you know, Asian high street, you know, shopping and stuff, and with no social distancing, how do you report on that story? Because it's a story in itself, without, you know, painting an entire, you know, ethnic group as, you know, as wrong or something. You know, there's so many different responsibilities, you know.
It's such a balancing act, and I feel like sometimes we carry such a burden on our shoulders as well, to say, you know, I'm here to offer this voice, but I also don't want to, you know, do my community, throw them under the bus, or I have a responsibility to do all of these things. And sometimes I feel like we carry this huge weight and put this pressure on ourselves as well too, right? That no one else is putting on, so we put it on ourselves. Molly, I'll ask you the same question, and also, do you ever worry sometimes about getting pigeonholed into, like, these are the only the kinds of stories I can tell?
I'd say we're both very lucky to be working at CityNews Toronto, because they're very diverse and they're very open to telling different types of stories. And that's why it's so nice to work at a newsroom like that, where you have so many different points of views, that I generally always feel quite comfortable sharing my point of view. Something I've always done in general, whether it's during the COVID-19 pandemic or throughout my career here, is I love including people of color, like kind of like what Shaheen's saying, like, you know, don't only think of white doctors when you need a doctor as an expert in your story. So for example, any story I might be doing, recently I was doing a story on mortgage deferrals. So I thought of, you know, people I might know, and I included a Pakistani couple in my story that is looking to get their mortgage deferred. So, or if I'm looking for a lawyer, I try to think of somebody of color, like, you know, whether they're Pakistani, Indian, a different type of South Asian, just because I think it's so important to see us in a normal light. It's not like the only time I want to talk to a Muslim expert is when I'm doing a Ramadan story or an Eid story. Let's include us in everything, because everything affects us. So even during this COVID-19 pandemic, if I'm looking for an expert, I make it a point to speak to somebody of color, whether I'm doing streeters, mosques. I try to go to people of color. Like, that's just a natural thing that I do. And I think it's really important, because I think a lot of the time, you know, whether you have a Caucasian reporter, if you look at some of their stories, generally they're speaking to Caucasian people. I don't know if it's something that happens naturally, but I think as us, there are less of us in the media, a lot more now than there were in the past, but I think it is our job to include people of color. So that's something I try to do whenever I'm working on a story.
Speaking of being, you know, Pakistani, South Asian, and not being a doctor or a lawyer or accountant, or kind of what the you know, the really approved of occupancies are. What occupations rather? What is it like being a journalist, you know, in your community? Is it something that people are really, you know, proud of? They love talking to you about it? Are there people who reach out to you to say, how do I, you know, get into journalism? Or, you know, is it something that people maybe are apprehensive about? Oh, I hear this a lot. Oh, the media is so biased. You know, they have their agenda. I don't even bother. How do you kind of engage with your community, and what conversations do you have about the role of media and your role? Amna, I'll ask you, because, you know, you've been in the industry longest, and maybe, you know, at the beginning of your career when there were less Muslims and you know, people of color in the industry, did you find it different, and have you seen a shift?
Yeah, so I'll share a fun fact. In my very first job, which was at ABC News, As I mentioned, I started just a couple of weeks before 9/11. I was the only Muslim on staff on that show. And I think I remember, feeling why this is why I need to be here, because I was a kid. I mean, I was 21 years old. I had barely figured out myself. And suddenly everyone on staff was coming to me with questions like, now, what does it mean? What does mujahideen mean? Like, what is that? And I was like, oh, I can't, I am not an expert in my faith. I would not put myself forward as that. And I felt that burden in the moment. And I realized what we needed was more people who could speak from more diverse perspectives, because I would not pretend to speak for all Muslims. I wouldn't pretend to speak for my, even the Muslims in my family, let alone everybody out there. So it was hard. It was hard at first, but I think it's gotten better over time. There are actually many Muslim members of staff now in the organization at NewsHour where I work. It's a balance, right? There's a burden to present the stories that need to be covered because they speak to your experience. And if they speak to yours, then they definitely speak to others too. But in the community, there aren't a lot of journalists, right? Like when I was coming up, all my friends were becoming doctors or lawyers or engineers or going into finance. And I was really lucky in that my parents said, you got to do what you love. So do what you love. And I tried it and I loved it. And they've always been nothing but supportive. But even now, when I go, I'll give an example. I went to speak at a recent event. I won't name the organization, but I was getting an award and I went up and I said, thank you so much for celebrating me. I'm so proud to be here and I'm so happy for your pride in me. If you're proud of me, though, you should know I am here because my parents never put a limitation on what I should study or when I should get married or where I should go live or when I should come home. And if you want your daughters and your sisters and your nieces to do the same thing, make sure they don't have any of those limitations too. And it was like crickets in the audience. So I know there are still, there's that struggle in our community a little bit that we really need to be more aggressive about, but it doesn't change unless we talk about it. So that's all we do.
Shaheen, what's your experience been like pursuing a career in journalism in your community? What's the conversation like?
So I think there are relatively few journalists in the UK really that are British, that are Muslim, or that are British. Yeah, of course they're British, but that are Muslim or South Asian. I think we have many South Asians, but just not very many Muslims. I sort of started off doing work at CNBC where there was literally no Muslims. There was literally no BME people. It was literally just white people. And for a place like CNBC, that's okay because they're literally, they're only talking about the economy and business and stuff. And, maybe you think it's okay at the time, but actually it's not. In any newsroom, in any workforce, it isn't. In terms of impressions in my community, carrying on from the CNBC point, I work at Channel 4 News now, which is, very diverse, which is, I didn't realize how undiverse CNBC was until I went to Channel 4 News. You feel so like you're supported and you have people to speak to, and you have your colleagues understand you in a way that they didn't understand you before. In terms of impressions on my community and stuff, anytime I tell someone I'm a journalist, my mum still thinks I'm a reporter for some reason. A lot of people still don't understand things about the newsroom. So a lot of what people do say when they when I tell them I'm a journalist is, what's your day-to-day? What do you do day-to-day? And I'm just so sick and tired of telling every single person the same day-to-day.
Most people also don't know what a producer is. Like when I was a producer, or what's
a graphics person, and without realizing that actually journalism, before there is an anchor on screen, there are so many people behind that anchor.
Someone I used to say when I was a chase producer, which is the same thing as an interview producer, and some people ask, well, what does that mean? I said, well, I do all of the work and then the host takes the credit.
Exactly.
I do all of the research, I book the guest, I write the suggested questions, and then she goes on TV.
Exactly. Basically, and you organize the interview, you organize everything.
Maliha, we've got about 6 minutes. Maliha, I want to ask you the same question as well.
Well, two of my siblings are lawyers, so there's obviously a lot of pressure for me to follow into their footsteps. But my mom, single parent, my dad passed away when I was 7. She was the type of parent who was always like, do what you love, and gave me a lot of support. A very independent mother who raised two very independent daughters and two great sons as well. So I had a lot of freedom to, very similar to what Amna was saying, where I think when your parents kind of give you that liberation, nobody else really matters. So I, you know, went full throttle, went to school for it. I've had a lot of South Asian girls reach out to me and be like, I can't believe you do what you do. How did you do it? A lot of questions, a lot of awe, because I still don't think that there's a lot of South Asians, you know, on air. So I still think it's kind of new-ish and exciting, even though we're in Toronto and it is very multicultural, but certainly a lot of support at home, which is why I've never really felt like I needed to fight for it. I'm lucky. And I just tell everyone that, you know, being a person of color, it's going to be 10 times harder for you to do it. So only do this for the right reasons. You have to really love it. Don't get in it for the fame, or because that's, here's my son, okay, who probably has to use the washroom. Sorry, that's all I can say. You can say hi.
Hi.
Hi, Gabriel. I'll answer the question as well, since we're almost out of time here. You know, for me, and you know, I'm the first person in hijab to be a reporter in Canada. And for me, when I first started, I worked in news behind the scenes as a writer and a producer for many years before I was on air. And as you said, Shaheen, like the first time that I walked into a newsroom, it was the biggest local newsroom in the country. And I was shocked at how white it was, because we were in the most multicultural city in the world, and the newsroom did not reflect our city at all. And as you said, you know, I was super green. I was an intern like Amna, and there were a lot of stories happening at that time around the place of religion in society. Quebec was going through this, they wanted to ban religious symbols in public spaces. The first time around, they did it a couple years later, and they did pass it. They wanted to ban religious symbols for public sector jobs. There was, there was a story about a school that was in a neighborhood that had a very high Muslim population, and they were getting hate because they were allowing the kids to pray Jummah in the school. So there were like a couple stories in a row that had to do with Muslims. And so same as you, they would turn to me, the Muslim in the newsroom, and ask me all these questions, as you said, about my religion. And I'm not a scholar. I don't purport to be the best Muslim in the world. And I'd have to be like, let me get back to you on that one, you know, and come back to them. But realizing how important it was, and I think they also realized how important it was to have a diversity of voices, diversity of experiences in their newsroom, to have access to those things, to be able to say, hey, can you look at this script and like just make sure that we're not saying anything offensive, or how do you pronounce this word? And so, you know, realizing the importance of being in the newsroom, as many of you have said, if you're not the one saying it, no one else will, and feeling that responsibility to be that person and raise your hand and say, maybe we should talk to this person, maybe we should think about doing this story, and constantly having to be that, you know, for them, you're a thorn in their side. Here comes Ginella again with, you know, but as you said, you know, as you kind of build your rapport over the years, people start to respect that opinion and recognize that it is valuable and it's important. So for me, you know, that's why, even though this job is not easy, it's a challenge every day. It's not glamorous. It's not, you know, you all know, you know, lots of people think of that, you know, we're in this career and it's so glamorous and amazing, and you're like, you don't even know half of it. And that's why I keep doing it, because I think it's so important for our newsrooms to reflect our societies and to tell all of our stories. Well, so we're almost out here. Yeah, I think that's kind of wrap up. Oh, there's Mudassar. I'll just say quickly. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Interrupt and bring you guys to a close.
Yes.
But I'd like to thank each and every one of you. It's been a fantastic transatlantic media conversation. We've been so lucky to have all of you guys representing major news organizations in Canada, the UK, and the United States, sharing your experiences. So thank you, Maliha, Amna, Shaheen, and Ginella.
Thanks so much.
Thank you,
everybody. Thanks. Good talking to you.
Now
Thank
I'm
you, everyone.
move on to our next, which is hosted by our very own Imam Asim Hafiz.